If you're watching this, you've almost certainly been on the internet long enough that you have almost definitely thrown on an episode of Death Battle, the series on Screw Attack, I mean Rooster Teeth, I mean itself, that's all about analyzing fictional characters in the context of a one-on-one battle to determine who would win a duel to the bitter end. And I feel like for a lot of people, it's big time coworker content. Like someone mentions to you that Death Battle is actually really cool, and it's like, oh, that edgy YouTube stuff where My Little Ponies die? And the reason I'm making this video is that it was, at one point, kind of a joke. At the admittance of its own creators, it was what passed for satire over a decade ago. I think more people have swung by an episode of Death Battle just once because they noticed a character they kinda like, more than people have stuck around as consistent viewers like I have. And most fair weathers probably walked away with a bad taste in their mouth watching the character they like get humiliated and or murdered. The team behind the show makes no secret that they use iconic and germane characters for sake of viewership, and clicking what looks like a fun Mario video just to see Mario die probably scorned a lot of folks. But like any show, even based in the domain of YouTube that lasts as long as this one has, sponsors and finances will do wonders for quality. And Death Battle as a series has experienced a gradual glow up of different animation styles. But did the writing follow? Or did the Sonic Murder show just get a nicer coat of paint? When I say I really love Death Battle, I get really hasty to explain myself. And what I really want to explore in this video is that this series didn't just get a staffing increase. When I say the show has gotten good and I show you some hype moments and aura, it's not that the memes where Blanca eats Pikachu just got a bigger budget. If you've been following this show long enough, you see a genuinely interesting evolution of writing and how it retrospects on the characters it uses. When I say Death Battle got great, I want to shake you and insist that if you're in the right headspace, following this series is one of the coolest internet communal rituals you can jump right into. But before we cover the recent Death Battle episodes I would gleefully describe as peak cinema, and I love sad grown-up movies, so you know I have a point, we have to cover how the show began and became something of a trashy pariah. Ben Singer pitched Death Battle in 2010, citing his biggest inspirations being the TV series Deadliest Warrior, where hypothetical battles were waged between historic figures like knights and samurai, and his colleague Monty Oum, an experienced animator who showcased his talents in fun CGI videos of video game characters fighting each other. Ben points specifically to an animation of Samus fighting Master Chief made by the late creator of RWBY that led to him proposing Death Battle to Screw Attack, who greenlit an initial season around the premise of pitting fictional characters against each other within the pretense of selling a distinct victor based on analysis of their weapons, armor, and skills. Ben roped in Chad James as they lent their voices to the show's invisible hosts, Wizard and Boomstick, and the first episode, Boba Fett vs. Samus, debuted on December 6th, 2010. The show's format would experience its genesis. Each combatant got a rundown of their history and combat skills, among other such factors. As Wiz and Boomstick, Ben and Chad would engage in some 2010s humor, which always ages well.
Though the basic power beam is a pea shooter with a pathetic range.
But when it's fully charged, it'll blow your face off. Bam! Shoot the whoop!
Then the fight would happen and it would look like this.
Fight!
So yeah, Death Battle circa 2010 is really hard to revisit, but it's also hard to ignore that it was built from the ground up by a two-person team on a bi-weekly schedule. Ben, as a matter of fact, describes himself as learning to animate as he made the show and took on the brunt of characters and action himself. Ben describes the first episode of Death Battle as rough, but the concept and overall ease to market gained the show sponsorships. Even though the first episode didn't shake the world with its viewership, it was given a lot of faith and some legs, and Ben, at the age of 21, had achieved an enviable success, even with all one could criticize about Boba Fett vs. Samus when it premiered 15 years ago. One of the best sources as to even wrapping my head around some of the strangeness of these early episodes is Ben's own published Road to 100 blog, a series of articles in which Singer looks back at the production of every death battle leading to the 100th episode that was celebrated back in 2018. Handling so much of the show himself, Ben had little faith in his capability as an animator, and he hoped to dazzle with video game logic, hence the short-lived fixture of characters sporting life bars. And to be fair, even this early it was clear Ben was something of a gifted interpreter of these characters, even in what could be considered a rough early episode as Akuma vs. Shang Tsung. A big focal point of the fight involves Shang Tsung shapeshifting, which causes Akuma to delay his attack, because he could only fight a worthy rival out of his proud nature. This is kind of a shockingly perfect encapsulation of the character's dynamic and how it would impact the flow of their fight. And this was the tiny inkling that would explode into Death Battle moving forward. The proof that even if Ben's animation skills had a long way to go, he was prepared to compensate by really geeking out as he took on comparing these characters. Ben today writes off a lot of the first season as lacking the show's later cohesive logic, because it was a comedy show first and foremost. It took a while for the creators to admit, but Death Battle Season 1 truly is jokes, within the guise and skin of a Deadliest Warrior-esque comparison, but there's also fairly ample suggestion to otherwise, that Ben and everyone who worked on the show gave it the most earnest effort possible. Ben claims he did the maximum par of research, citing that he watched the entirety of the 2003 Ninja Turtles show in a single weekend for the Ninja Turtles Battle Royale, to the point of playing 2 episodes simultaneously on different devices and taking notes on both at once by craning back and forth between 2 screens. This arduous effort results in an episode with no dialogue where the 4 Ninja Turtle brothers murder each other in cold blood over the course of a very brief fight scene. I think this episode is a fairly good snapshot of where Death Battle was at this point. An unreal amount of work was put on 2 or so crew members that resulted in a rushed assessment of the titular stars of the battle, which also begot an humiliating and even dismissive coverage of characters. Starscream was literally eaten by Rainbow Dash. Koopa vs. Goomba was a silly premise where the characters are both undone by their repetitive in-game behaviors. Rogue vs. Wonder Woman was largely an excuse for humor centered on the male gaze. Pikachu vs. Blanca was literally a battle initiated into production because Chad noticed Blanca had a sprite of him operating a blender, and he thought it would be funny to end the battle with Blanca putting Pikachu in a blender. And that's all to say nothing of battles that were largely encouraged by Screw Attack to capitalize on big trends at the time, resulting in the infamous Justin Bieber versus Rebecca Black episode, one that for all apparent reasons is almost universally agreed on as the worst episode of the show's history, and one that Ben agrees he regretted almost immediately. Death Battle Season 1 at its worst has the substance of lower-end college humor sketches, and yet it was hard to ignore the effort put into the show and the love that could really shine through at the show's best. Ben had an affection for obscure video game characters that got small but dedicated audiences excited. Where else could you see Mike Haggar representation pre-Marvel vs. Capcom 3? And the stat coverage still showed Ben was committed, even if it would be impossible for any human to sum up a storied fictional character over the course of just 2 weeks of research and animation. The big shift in Death Battle could be felt at its 19th episode, Peach vs. Zelda. It was here that, entirely as a goof, Ben crunched the numbers on the force required for Peach to kick a soccer ball, as she does in her Mega Strike in Mario Strikers, a unit of pressure per square inch that, against all odds, put Peach far above Zelda in strength. And it was creating a feasible grounding of that absurd premise of Peach defeating Zelda that marked a flick of the light switch for Death Battle. It's also worth noting that Ben was able to take his hands off the role of sole animator and devote more of his efforts to timing and research for the first time, while animator Jordan Lang made a modest but comparatively really fun fight animation for Peach and Zelda that showcased their abilities in a wide scope. This episode is still far from the heights the series would reach, but it was a start and it would be followed by contemporaries that would portend more of a trend upward. Spider-Man vs. Batman, for the time it was made, is considered pretty decent as well. A cool fight animation, if a bit simplistic, and one with a verdict that held up to decent scrutiny and argument. Link vs. Cloud, around that same time, took itself in a similarly serious tone, with an outcome that was debatable, but wasn't poised on soccer spin-off moves or pony memes. Not to mention Jordan Lang created this battle in 3D, fully surprising Ben, who provided the usual 2D assets. Again, this was an early go with rough edges, but it set a tone for more serious fights, episodes, and matches that would play no small part in portending Death Battle's biggest leap at that time. The Season 1 finale was none other than Goku vs. Superman, the most frequently requested matchup at the time and maybe the most popular versus matchup ever. With so much riding on this episode, it was beyond clear it couldn't be another gag. Huge strides were made in assuring the research and explanation for the battle's outcome would be thorough and specific. Superman bested Goku, followed by the show's most earnest outcome rundown at the time. And as you can guess, the episode wasn't controversial in the least. From deducing Goku's entire Snake Way trip to validating claims of Superman having infinite strength, there was a more grounded, numbers-based mentality rushing towards Death Battle as we exit Season 1 into Season 2. Though highly interpretive and humorous character research wasn't off the table, Death Battle was, within Season 2, developing a more cohesive and consistent logic to how it interprets events and scales characters. You had the odd, shitpost adjacent fight here and there, but as early as Season 2, you had the odd, Stone Cold classic episode that would catch you by surprise. RoboCop vs. Terminator had some growing pains in the animation, but it's a fun and authentic take on both characters, especially considering how rarely the show to this day uses characters that originate from films as opposed to games and comics. The starter Pokemon Battle Royale felt like an evolution, no pun intended, of Death Battle's interpretive outcomes blended with their mathematical analysis, as they set up every possible move pool of Charizard, Blastoise, and Venusaur at the time to determine which of the three had the most concrete advantage a majority of the time. Which, if you think about it, it's a pretty sound way to settle that debate. And Solid Snake vs. Sam Fisher is honestly about as good as you could hope the episode would be if it were made today. You may also be aware it was in Season 2 that there was arranged a Goku vs. Superman rematch, requested on the grounds of the new Dragon Ball Super series and new forms Goku had attained, leaving his fans hoping he could pull through. The battle concluded with Superman winning again, coupled with an explanation that tried to ease the blow of a second Superman victory by somewhat accurately positing the writing of both characters in a way that overcorrects by transparently hoisting Goku as an objectively better character than Superman.
Ultimately, Goku vs. Superman comes down to a difference of limits and purpose. What happens when you pit a man with the power to break any limits against a being with no limits in the first place? Well, only one has limits to give at all. But that's exactly what makes him such a memorable character.
Think about it. If you had a Goku that was as powerful as Superman, would you even want him?
The winner is Superman.
Fucking Superman.
Ben, in recent years, has stated he dislikes this episode to a point that it's currently unlisted. As the show began to stand upright, it began to be somewhat conceivable to take a stab at who the winner may be from the outside looking in. By Season 3, it was no longer a question as to if Riptor would die at the hands of Yoshi because it would be mad funny. Rather, a true analysis of weapons, armor, and skill, at least from the point of view of some range of viewers. The strength and speed demonstrated by every feat of Mega Man is information that's available to anyone daring enough to do their own research. So it said a lot that Death Battle reached a reliable logic to a point that it was something you could stake a bet on. You'd think a show where battle outcomes become predictable to a point of accessible science would be ruined. Wouldn't it be easy to determine Flash would kill Pietro Maximoff weeks in advance of the actual episode, but the further magic of the show is that it wasn't always that simple. It was around the release of Season 3 that the G1 Research Blogs came about, a fan site where dedicated researchers would take it upon themselves to conduct their own assessment of two announced combatants and put out the odds of who they supposed the winner would be, usually the representatives split into votes. The beauty of this is while the G1 blogs were a decent barometer as to who may win, the blog could habitually turn out to be wrong, resulting in upsets with occasionally fairly sound reasoning. Dante vs. Bayonetta, circa 2016, was assessed by G1 to end almost unanimously in a win for Bayonetta, only for the actual show to give the win to Dante, and do so with an argument that made a good deal of sense. It wasn't a clear-cut fight by any means. Bayonetta was in fact credited as far stronger than Dante physically, in a way that she'd win the fight if it were interpreted that way, but Dante's speed and durability were poised with more emphasis. Viewers walked away realizing no battle was as straightforward as it appeared, and it wasn't so much the character's feats on paper, but the interpretation of the show and the moment the character is plucked from that's truly important. What became truly fun about following Death Battle around this point was that the outcome of any given fight could be argued to either be complete nonsense or interpretively correct, and that's what grew to be what made the show interesting. Versus Battle wikis have tiered characters' relative power levels to a point that in a soulless mathematical sense, you can look up who can blow up a bigger planet and know the winner then and there. But Death Battle is less about that, and more about taking a snapshot of the two focused characters in a way that leaves room for conversation. Take Bowser vs. Ganondorf, which ended in a victory for Ganon on the grounds that he historically has only been killed and made vulnerable to holy weapons, which Bowser doesn't regularly access. Feels pretty open and shut, and at the time it wasn't that tough a pill to swallow. But the episode is actually rather contentious today, to a point that the team did a roundup of episodes with outcomes they consider wrong, and Bowser vs. Ganondorf was among them. It's worth noting that Ganon's main weakness is holy weapons, but to assume nothing else could kill him, regardless of the magnitude, is to operate under what's been dubbed a no-limits fallacy. Via surviving black holes and fighting characters that can destroy stars, Bowser, even if demonstrated by what resembles cartoon logic at times, so significantly overpowers Ganon that many would consider it unfair to dub Ganon the winner just because Bowser can't drill one specific weakness. If this fight happened today, the team behind the show has said Bowser would win, meaning it's nearly impossible to claim most of these matchups don't have some room to debate and interpret, so it continues to be fun to rabble and wonder how different elements of these characters would be swung. Take one of my favorite characters ever, Lex Luthor, who had a memorable but ill-fated outing in Season 2 against Iron Man. A few years passed and the show announces that Lex is coming back, this time against Doctor Doom. And no, Lex Luthor didn't literally or conscientiously hit the gym in preparation for a second fight, but he was in countless comics in between, where he was introduced to new devices, feats, and a wider range of foes within his own universe that showed off his capabilities better. It wasn't the same Lex Luthor who lost before who is up to bat this time. Just like how it's not the same New York Yankees who are trying again to win the World Series. It's not the same Bianca Belair trying for WWE glory. It's not the same Timothée Chalamet losing the Best Actor Oscar again. It was a Lex Luthor who only had better chances as he developed as a character and a combatant. And he still lost, and that hurt, but the rush of hoping so was worth it. Just the same as watching your favorite wrestler get pinned, or getting emotional when your favorite artist didn't take home the Grammy, because it's these losses that make the wins all the more special. In 2017, Metal Sonic was seen as little more than an automaton battering ram with material from the games and OVAs, costing him a fight with Zero that's hard to imagine him losing today. After jumping forward nearly a decade later, where the IDW comics can supplement how his ability to adapt and copy biodata works, it turns him into a nightmare who wipes the floor with Dragon Ball powerhouses like Cell. These characters and the perception of them is in such consistent flux, with so many reimaginings and recreations, that's not unlike observing a prizefighter in the context of their livelihood and career. Exactly the thing that makes you root for your favorite, as well as that which makes it heartbreaking when your favorite loses, especially when it feels like that wasn't supposed to happen. Maybe the series' most infamous episode outlines this rather beautifully. Ben 10 versus Green Lantern was a battle that sparked insane discourse, perhaps one with more ripples overall than any of the rematches between Goku and Superman, if you could believe it. The Ben 10 fanbase was larger and more vocal than anyone realized, and they didn't take kindly to Hal Jordan giving Ben the business end of a Green Lantern boot. The outcome had fairly solid reasoning behind it, albeit the actual scripting of the episode wasn't all that thorough in laying these determining research points out, which resulted in confusion and frustration, especially among those rooting for Ben. There's a strong case for Hal Jordan beating Ben Tennyson, but not via a left field gag like this. It's the kind of fight that if they both went all the way, their powers would cease to be feasible to the human eye. They'd become comets of pure cosmic energy trying to outlast one another. So it's harder to justify the actual fight choreo ending in Hal snipping Ben's arm off like he's Flat Stanley. The Death Battle Crew podcast had a lot to answer for, as Ben vs. Hal was at the time the most disliked episode of the show, back when YouTube let you see that number. For a litany of reasons, Ben losing his arm doesn't make sense, but they were curt that the most accurate representation of Hal and Ben's maximum power colliding would just be visually a big explosion, and they wanted to do something more offbeat since the most authentic imagery of these two going at it was something the writers and boarders found a bit rote. That's something I sympathized with to a point. The Death Battle team had every reason Green Lantern could win in the sense of an actual argument. He could counter Ben's forms that mess with time, space, and reality just by doing the same, but they don't have a reason to end the fight on a gag that wouldn't feel out of place in Season 1 and contradicts the lore of the characters as well as their personalities, considering how hard it is to fathom Hal Jordan just callously smashing a teenager into paste. Ben vs. Green Lantern was sort of a wake-up call. If the results of a battle were going to be believable, then not just the showcase of the characters' skills and powers had to be, but the way the characters were portrayed in terms of their actual behavior had to hold water as well. The show had developed in a way that a glib, comedic fatality could undermine the argument behind a battle. The show had come a long way from Season 1 at this point, but there were still higher peaks to reach for. This was all to indicate a shift in Death Battle's mentality, from primarily a comedic parody show to a serious look at these beloved characters, their abilities, and their nature, particularly in the context of a clash to the death. There is a very easy gotcha for Death Battle matchups in a way of putting a finger up and stating, well, they would just be friends. So a concentrated effort on part of the writing team was put into finding ways to make these characters aggro each other for at least something resembling a good reason. Listening to the Cast and Crew podcasts, a huge landmark for this mentality was Kingdom Hearts King Mickey versus Jedi Master Yoda. In line with both characters having an honorable and reverent personality and an inclination towards pacifism, the two face off in what resembles a lighthearted spar that escalates. The battle ends in King Mickey's victory, only for Yoda to playfully carry on bantering as a Force ghost, acting as if dying hasn't even really fazed him. In many ways, death means little to a Jedi, and it means even less, frankly, to any fictional character, broadly speaking. By having Darth Vader step into the world of Naruto, you've already broken the fabric and canon of everyone involved. And to some degree, Death Battle found some footing by having the characters just not take death so seriously when they could afford it. Goku vs. Superman's second rematch after the famously pacifist Superman kills Goku a third time ends with both fighters fist bumping. And the hosts say this.
Goku vs. Superman breaches a broader zeitgeist. It's more than just two characters fighting. For a whole generation, especially in 90s America, superheroes represented an unyielding status quo. Spider-Man, Batman, Captain America rarely change who they are or what they believe in. For a lot of people, that's tiring, and Superman is an icon of that. Then along came anime. There was a whole other world of ideas and stories for us sheltered Westerners to experience, and Goku's an icon of that. So while many see this as a debate between characters, others see it as a debate of ideologies and culture. And if that's what's at stake, who wants Goku to lose?
You sure you're not overthinking this?
It's not our intent, but it does call into question what we're doing. How can people agree with what we take as fact when fiction relies on interpretation? Are we stripping characters of their importance by simplifying them to contestants in a vacuum of violence? And if so, then what's the point?
Because it's fun, Wiz! Damn it, man! There's more than one way to appreciate something! We're having a great time talking about awesome characters and slamming action figures together. And that's okay!
Yeah, you're right.
At a certain point, it feels a bit like the characters themselves are in on the premise of Death Battle. Characters encountering one another feels less inflammatory or mean-spirited. Might Guy finishes off All Might with a move that costs him all of his own life force. A victory nonetheless, but one that results in his own death. He utters,
Good fight. Let's do it again.
Obviously, this is meant to be read somberly, but between shonen anime protagonists, superheroes, and video game bosses that are no stranger to dips in lava, I think in most of these situations, you could make a case that death might as well be sport for these characters. This is obviously, again, an extreme exaggeration, but it's one that the showrunners and crew find ways to hoist. Take Ruby vs. Maka, which ends with Ruby slain, and Maka tenderly stopping Soul from consuming her. This resulted in fan art of the two on friendly terms that the crew behind the show personally endorsed as an epilogue, as if Ruby was restored from her soul after the fact. That's not to say every well-intentioned death battle got the kumbaya smooth over. There have been some genuinely interesting misunderstandings between characters as well. Jonathan Joestar mistakes Tanjiro and Nezuko from Demon Slayer as brainwashed minions of Dio, and given how closely a demon in Demon Slayer resembles a JoJo vampire, that's really not a stretch. Jonathan slays who he assumes to be a follower of evil, and the tragedy of the situation is played straight, as Jonathan realizes his mistake and vows to protect Nezuko. On the other hand, sometimes the concept of two characters fighting is so absurd I have to respect the writing choice to just bite the bullet and go sicko mode. Steven Universe vs. Star Butterfly is a battle between two happy-go-lucky heroes who end up in a frivolous scrap over sandcastles. Both characters are known to get drunk on their own power due to inexperience with magic that's rooted in canon, which causes the battle to escalate into a nightmarish rampage that feels sort of like a full-circle surreal commentary on how silly the notion is of two fighters like these coming to blows, to a point that the winner doesn't show any remorse that I highlighted before.
Oh my gosh. I won!
So the basic concept of respect was put into place for new fighters moving forward, and this would be levied with the overall circumstance of their wins and losses. Your favorite character losing is a literal death sentence, but that felt less like an anxiety given how gracefully the writing team approached the idea of some of these characters falling down with some dignity. SpongeBob SquarePants was slated to fight specifically the Hanna-Barbera iteration of Aquaman. The episode was put into production on the assumption Aquaman must have some bizarre Toon Force feat that would put him on a similar level to SpongeBob, who is, to the surprise of some, one of the series' most impressive combatants when you take his cartoony antics literally and mathematically. Ultimately, exhaustive research found this specific version of Aquaman was actually not that strong, to a point that when numbers are crunched, he's laughably outgunned by SpongeBob. Rather than reel the episode back in for being too much of a stomp, the writing team leaned into it as poor Aquaman spends the entire battle playing catch-up with SpongeBob's varied abilities. Adding insult to injury, Aquaman gets a vision of other strong versions of himself and laments.
I see it now. A multiverse of Aquaman. And out of all of them, I'm the lamest fucking one!
And this is where a season 1 episode of Death Battle would stop and kill Arthur and dance on his grave for being so pitiful. Instead, the battle slows down.
People used to say the same kind of things about me. Goofball, wingnut, knucklehead McSpazatron. But every day, I get back up and say 2 words. I'm ready.
So even if you were somehow the world's biggest fan of Hanna-Barbera Aquaman, this clear outclass of power at least does some justice to his character. You can't pull this kind of thing with every matchup possible, but SpongeBob is a rare instance of a ray of sunshine to friend and foe, to a point that the intervention feels organic, even as the fight carries on to the bitter end. Take it as you will that this ending made me emotional the first time I watched it.
Don't cry, Sponge. Let's be super.
A show focused on characters fighting to the death on sight, no matter how little sense it made, grew into something with potential to be a real love letter to the characters involved, instead of just a crude joke. And that also opened the gates for characters done supposedly dirty in the past to have a more well-formed outing. Take Shadow the Hedgehog, who was used not once, but twice in Death Battle's early days, and to varying degrees of fairness, he was thrown under the bus, losing to Vegeta and Mewtwo, who both send him to a death played for laughs after repeating Maria Robotnik's final words to him.
Uh-oh.
Sayonara.
Sayonara.
Which takes the sort of embarrassing deaths he's put through to a level of just plain cruelty, like if you said never let go before obliterating Rose DeWitt with a key blast or something. So imagine being a Shadow fan, having these chips on your shoulder, and seeing his announced 3rd appearance on Death Battle versus Ryuko from Kill la Kill. The fight rages on, and if you were burned those last couple times, you might get a touch of PTSD when you hear Ryuko say,
Sayonara, dipshit!
And almost as if acknowledging those last occasions and breaking the 4th wall, Shadow says,
Shut up!
And reflecting on this, it hit me why that felt so triumphant. Shadow not only lost his first 2 fights, but the reasoning was questionable, and it was clearly played for laughs at Shadow's expense in a number of aspects. So seeing Shadow triumph years later, and taking into account that he got new media appearances that could support that win, as well as the Death Battle team taking criticism on the chin and treating him more fairly, despite the layers of meta and fiction applied, it feels not unlike seeing your favorite actor finally taking home an Oscar, or the team you've watched lose over and over finally win the Super Bowl. Our favorite characters start to feel real, and that same section of our brain gets scratched, and we get that same hit of dopamine when we're proud of a loved one. It's just that that loved one is Donkey Kong. Though maybe the all-time best underdog narrative in Death Battle is centered on the show's use of the Incredible Hulk. Hulk's first appearance on the show was in a fairly straightforward battle against Doomsday, a Superman villain who proved to be Hulk's sought-after equal in rage and strength. It was a city-leveling brawl to behold that ended in Doomsday's particular brand of immortality, wearing down the Hulk's healing factor until the fight was punctuated brutally. Hulk was down, but far from over. After a few years, Hulk was set to reappear, this time opposite Broly from Dragon Ball. A frustration felt with this death battle that occurs a lot is the fact that many of these characters are living documents, meaning they're suspect to new developments and even new abilities while their death battle is in production, which means there's a frankly reasonable chance Hulk comic releases while Hulk's episode is being made with lore or details that could fully flip the result of a battle. The animation quality has grown so high over the years that I'm personally sympathetic to that struggle from both sides, since using characters only if their work or IP is complete would be a fool's errand with very limited choices, meaning it's kind of a c'est la vie situation if a battle ends up outdated, even in an unlucky case of in media res content. This phenomenon impacted Hulk vs. Broly as it was made when the Hulk's contemporary comic series Immortal Hulk was still in progress, meaning elements of that story could only sort of hastily be implemented. As the name suggests, Immortal Hulk established Hulk's Green Door, which crusades him to the place below all every time he nominally dies. There was still so much to learn about this lore, so it was reduced to the safe assumption that Hulk could only revive with the Green Door if some trace of his body remained, and the idea that Broly could still win by fully disintegrating his opponent was the judgment call made on the fight's final outcome. As Immortal Hulk the series carried on, it was established Hulk could come back from just about anything, even the destruction of his own universe. The place below all is its own pocket of the multiverse that will revive the Hulk over and over, firmly putting an end to Broly's chances at winning. And the Death Battle team would acknowledge that, if reassessed today, Hulk would be the winner. The fight would remain a record of mistake out of the creative team's control. Hindsight is always 20/20, but this meant demand was pretty heated for Hulk to come back yet again, this time with no restrictions, now that the Green Door was established and more holistically understood. But his most popular choice for an opponent was no easy victory. Many rooted on the idea that he test his mettle against another green monster with allegorical ties to the faults of humanity, Godzilla, who has himself experienced some upgrades that hoisted him far past what meets the eye. The anime Godzilla Singular Point essentially ties every Godzilla together as the avatars of an eldritch deity with the ability to warp reality. So many Godzilla variants appear in so many realities because they stem from one denominator, the omnipotent Godzilla Ultima. Death Battle had been running long enough that Godzilla appeared long prior in a battle with Gamera where he was still, in a nutshell, a particularly strong and hard-to-kill lizard. But Singular Point, by this time, not only interprets the character as an unfathomably powerful denizen of a higher plane of existence, but one that ties every continuity of Godzilla as parts of this horrifying sum, meaning there was no skirting around this being any kind of outlier, and Godzilla Ultima could and would be fully considered for the fight with Hulk. After 2 losses, the latter of which was largely agreed to be under unfair circumstances, it was very much the popular opinion that Hulk was now biting off far more than he could chew. The Singular Point Godzilla could change reality on a whim, destroy universes, bounce back from any degree of damage, and draw from a range of abilities and hacks that border on absurd. Hulk had his defenders, but many felt he was on his way to his third death on the show. The day of the fight arrived, and Hulk's reputation was on the line. Either he would clear his name by toppling a foe that made his prior to retroactively look like child's play, or he'd go home with a record of 3 losses and no wins. Hulk's brute strength overpowered Godzilla, but Godzilla's endless adaptability kept him coming back. And yet, the same was true for Hulk. Both of these behemoths killed each other over and over again, forcing both to repeatedly exercise their respective means of reviving themselves. In a really interesting bit of world building within the battle itself, you hear someone mention,
"It's been days since the battle began, and the red dust is spreading. Godzilla has grown in size, but we believe we are..."
Hulk and Godzilla have been fighting for days on end. Every second Hulk fights, Bruce Banner, ever present, is studying his opponent. Hulk can revive from the Green Door as many times as he wants, allowing an unprecedented chance for Bruce to wrap his head around this opponent with great care. The fight illustrates that Bruce Banner was easily smarter than any of the scientists that cracked the code of defeating the previous Godzillas, including Ultima. It illustrates that the Green Door was outside of Ultima's range of a reality warping effect, meaning if Ultima destroyed all life in the universe, the Green Door could still spawn in the place below all, meaning Hulk and Bruce, in a manner of speaking, as a team, had unlimited time and tries to endure Godzilla's endless desire to rampage. And even if it took days or years, with no way to kill Hulk definitively, Godzilla would eventually find his weakness drilled by Bruce's ingenuity and Hulk's strength.
You did it, big guy. We did it.
And obviously, this is a work of fiction, but it felt like Hulk, the character, somehow pulled through. He had razor-thin chances of winning, and objects in motion tend to stay in motion, but there was ample evidence right down to subjects of science Banner showed repeated excellence in, and the size of the Marvel Universe next to Godzilla's. Anyone can write a fanfiction where Hulk kills Godzilla, but what's impressive is Death Battle as a series established a culture and a rule set that let these two characters feel less like instruments of fiction and more like real combatants. Every detail is backed up with receipts and presented with the meta context in mind that Hulk was fighting to redeem 2 past losses, not by the show itself, but by everyone who loved the Hulk and didn't want to see him die a 3rd time. And as Bruce Banner let out a sigh of relief and collapsed after securing his victory, it's almost easy to read that his emotional catharsis is claiming a victory he's been owed for years. For people rooting for Hulk all that time, and even soured over his previous losses, this was downright revelational. If you're still not sure what I mean, it's a lot like pro wrestling. Intellectually, I know Roman Reigns didn't win a championship match or anything like that. I know it's scripted, but the process of scripting pro wrestling takes into account the climate of the fans, the history of the character, the warmth of their reception, and the timing of how they should fare against their opponent. Even though wrestlers are fictional characters, their paths are inspired by how their fans perceive them, and inflections and dispositions of the performer. It's a blurred line that carries into a lot of sports and celebrity culture. It's why we engage in pop stan wars that we know are at least a little bit manufactured by the media. Why 2 athletes cutting a promo rarely actually hate each other, but they'll play up the competitive rivalry to get the crowd excited. Hulk didn't literally walk into that battle acknowledging he's lost twice, but if you've been following the show long enough and you've been involved in the fan community, all of that pressure came naturally, and it made Hulk's triumph feel like your favorite team just won the World Series. Not just because of Hulk's literal, tangible victory in a battle, but because it was the fairest shake his full set of abilities ever got to that point. He did the full 9 yards his fans always knew he could. With that said, Death Battle redemption like this doesn't always come in the form of a victory. To start that story, let me rewind you back to 2015, when Death Battle did Red and Charizard from Pokemon versus Tai and Agumon from Digimon. This was well into Death Battle's tenure making higher quality episodes. We were far past Bomberman vs. Dig Dug by this point, but there were still some growing pains to be ironed out. It was very in vogue to poke fun at Pokemon at this time, and while Digimon winning with an overall way bigger power ceiling isn't an unfair call, the battle presented its arguments in ways that did not feel impartial. A lot of it comes down to the climax, where Mega Charizard is clashing with Wargreymon, and Tai assaults Red to interrupt his flow of commanding his Pokemon, illustrating that Digimon tamers are more consistently involved in battle than Pokemon trainers, which isn't necessarily true. This leads to Mega Charizard being clueless as to how to fight without orders, which is also plainly erroneous to Pokemon lore, and would feel less like an argument made in poor faith if this didn't lead to Wargreymon impaling Charizard on his claws before crushing Red beneath his own broken Pokemon and mercilessly raining down upon them with his strongest attack to disintegrate what's left of them both. Salt in the wound further was the phrasing used in the rundown of the outcome.
First, when comparing the trainers, Red's bond with Charizard was strong enough to Mega Evolve, but like most Pokemon, their relationship is still one of master and, well...
Slave, come on, you know it's true. I know there's the bond of friendship and whatever, but when Red's through with Charizard, it's back to the tiny spherical prison.
If this still doesn't have you convinced that aspects of this episode were made out of spite toward Pokemon, taking a look at behind-the-scenes materials, there's apparently a scrapped idea for this episode that involved the fight opening with Ash Ketchum, Red's counterpart from the anime, who is parallel to Red but importantly distinct, making a brief cameo only to be immediately killed. I'd say in a pure sense of who would win, Digimon beats Pokemon, fair and square, but it says a lot that within the Death Battle writers' room, it wasn't enough that one Pokemon protagonist got an embarrassing death. I don't think they necessarily hated Pokemon, but it was just a very easy target to make look weak and pathetic, next to something thought of as more tough like Digimon. Ash in particular had horrible PR at the time. For such a long-running hero, the popular opinion is he was a one-dimensional, babyish protagonist who lost big tournaments and important battles to a mimetic extent. It's no surprise he was meant to be treated as a walking punchline in a death battle that wasn't even really his. At the time, one may have shuddered to consider what a full battle focused on Ash would look like, and we wouldn't get the answer for another 11 years. Some important context in between all that time is that in this decade and change leading up to Ash's full debut death battle, the Pokemon anime got a real glow up. The Digimon battle was made around the era of X and Y, the points where the Pokemon show really felt like it was going through the motions before the Alola adaptation gave the cast and world an effervescent makeover. There was also a big shift in writing, in that Ash early on was frequently only allowed to have cutesy, marketable Pokemon that rarely evolved, while these later seasons saw him take up genuinely strategic aces like Gengar and Lucario, while still keeping a genuine bond with his eternal ride-or-die Pikachu. Most gracefully of all, the dilemma of Ash being an unaging loser whose dreams would never come true because the show would end was solved when it was finally decided Ash would win the Pokemon League and the show would end. His adventure continued off-screen, but it was settled that the focus of the Pokemon anime would give him a break. Something folks begged for so Ash could get some closure instead of getting back up just to lose again and again. It seemed holistically like a perfect time to cover Ash in Death Battle, and he was slated to fight against another monster tamer from a similar era of anime, Yu-Gi-Moto. Given Ash's close relation to Red, That fight from so long ago still loomed. The misconceptions Red's defeat leaned on and rather indignifying writing all around it was triggering to some. Ash had a chance to bring pride back to the iconic, hat-bearing Pokemon hero, but the tea leaves of the researchers on the G1 blogs predicted. So it seemed clear Pokemon, as it was with Digimon, was just leagues below the overall power cap of Yu-Gi-Oh's strongest monsters. Ash had his loyalists, but it seemed we were in for another wash. Mind you, Red was never the mean-Don punching bag that Ash was. If Red was literally bloodied and paralyzed under his own companion's corpse, one could only imagine what Ash was in for. Battle Uncorked and what occurred was one of the best episodes ever. Given the huge number of characters on both sides, it's a wonder how many little skirmishes and interactions the animation team was able to work in, and Ash held his own respectably, reflecting the credit the writers wanted to give his capacity for strategy. He makes it as far as marshaling his Pokemon to land a pretty crucial direct blow on Yami Yugi, knocking the Pharaoh over and forcing him to tag out to Little Yugi for the final phase of the fight. But while Ash could keep his rival on his toes, standing up to the sheer power of Yugi's stronger monsters just wasn't in the cards. Again, no pun intended. It's around this point they stop beating around the bush. Yugi's wider arsenal of spells and traps put Ash's mob of Pokemon in a vulnerable position while he summons Halakti, the deity credited with creating the Duel Monsters universe. Ash looks up at the strongest odds he's ever been faced with. Pikachu looks on, doubt apparent in his eyes, before Ash encourages his companion. And note his dialogue here is,
Pikachu, let's finish this. Together!
He pointedly doesn't say, let's win this together. He knows there's a good chance he's on the losing side, but he's determined to finish strong and help his Pokemon do the same, as Ash and Pikachu pose while we're treated to a visual Easter egg showing every variation of Ash and Pikachu's designs over the years, communicating how long these two have fought together and how huge a journey was potentially about to end, as Ash and Pikachu unsheath their strongest move for one last push.
With it, I'll send your Thunderbolt back to attack your light points directly!
Smoke clears. What remains is Ash and all of his Pokemon, his friends petrified in stone, vanquished without fear or retreat, not as slaves or lambs to slaughter, but as a family facing their final battle the way they faced every battle, as a team, before Yugi gives his opponents a good-spirited thumbs up. Ash lost and barely had an argument to ever win, but he went out like a real champion, not like a joke, and all of the goodwill that the show's treatment of Red dried up felt truly forgiven in that moment. It doesn't need to be through a sweeping victory. There are plenty of ways you can show a character comes up short to their rival without painting an L on their forehead. Even as Yugi walked away the winner, it's hard to argue the narrative emotionality of the fight's writing didn't hinge on Ash as something of an underdog protagonist for it, something that character has always really excelled at being, which lends weight that befits one of the best short-term narratives Death Battle has ever crafted in its format. I hope what I've illustrated is that the real artfulness of this series isn't just necessarily pitting cool characters against each other, it's meeting the moment for both in a way that represents the time their battle is made and the climate of the Versus community, in a way that builds a brand of hype and excitement nothing else really can. Which is why it pains me to segue that a better way yet to illustrate that is to discuss one of the series' largest fumbles of that principle. On December 18th, 2023, we got the sensational Galactus vs. Unicron, one of the most highly requested battles ever that took over a decade of the series' history to tackle because the team wanted to assure that they had the budget and production capability to represent two fully Titanic characters coming to blows. It was a battle that altogether felt big enough to work as the series finale, and as the crew made this episode, they probably didn't know it very well may have been. It was shortly after this episode that Rooster Teeth was shut down by its parent company, Warner Brothers. Most Rooster Teeth IP are still scattered to the winds and dormant, but the Death Battle team scrambled to avoid a similar fate. For most of 2024, the show would be on hiatus as the team explored new options, juggling the possibilities of seeking new parent sponsor, changing the title of the show in case they couldn't retain the IP, and dodging unsavory potential buyers. A solution would be secured in the form of a Kickstarter campaign that could fund a tenure of the show operating independently, which meant more creative freedom and interaction with fans, but also something of a fine edge to a higher need to do well and boost views. The show would still take up sponsors, but viewer retention would be more important than ever without a parent company. So popular matchups would be a paramount consideration. The first episode within this comeback lineup would need to be something of an event, and the combatants chosen to draw folks back into Death Battle and awaken it from a 10-month slumber would broadcast in October of 2024. Bardock vs. Omni-Man, the father of Goku versus the father of Invincible. A hotly requested matchup between two popular fandoms. Omni-Man vs. Homelander a couple years prior is one of the show's most famous episodes ever, and Dragon Ball is a crowded and reliable fandom space in versus communities, and especially Death Battle. Win or lose, Dragon Ball fans could be relied on as the soccer hooligans of the versus space that'll drum up a lot of attention. As exciting as this comeback was for Death Battle, the debate of the matchup itself, in the eyes of some, left less to the imagination. The various tastemakers and tea leaves of the versus community predicted early and firmly that Bardock was the clear winner. Dragon Ball as a universe scales high above Invincible, and Bardock should clear Omni-Man's feats even before factors are breached, like Bardock's Grade 8 form and Super Saiyan, a form Bardock only uses very briefly in a non-canon special. Death Battle doubled down and included both of these factors in the fight, and anyone who thought Bardock could win without these factors was assured further he would win with them. Yet, as the battle raged,
Your time is up!
You said Saiyan. Remember it.
Fuck.
no one saw this coming, and less than no one was calm about it. But Death Battle has had outrageous outcomes in the past, and been capable of backing it up with a convincing argument. To the credit of the writing of the episode, the breakdown of both characters' abilities on paper crafts something fairly convincing in support of Omni-Man winning. But the more people looked deeper at the evidence, there was some head-scratching conclusions. To describe some of the flimsier arguments of this outcome, it would take kind of a dense understanding of both series to the tip of the iceberg, including crediting Omni-Man with destroying a planet, while sort of quietly skirting around the context that he managed this under very specific circumstances involving help from other characters and rather distinct resources. Weirdly, it's not as if they only behaved this selectively with Omni-Man. Bardock was similarly compared to King Vegeta, who's seen in one bit of the anime destroying 3 planets with the wave of a hand. But this is a flashback that many argue is a dramatization of a more gradual conquest the Saiyans carried out, as opposed to something any of them were literally capable of on the spot. A lot of factors were taken literally and treated with sort of a myopic face value, to a point that among many hot debates as to if this fight was right or wrong, I think the most accurate descriptor at a certain point is to say this was a fight between versions of Nolan and Bardock that kind of don't exist. Rather, weird mishmashes of out-of-context feats and imagery that neither could really feasibly claim. We come to a point in this video where a more inflammatory writer could make this a matter of accusation and blame. But I want to clarify, there's a difference between this and observation. I observe that more often than not, the Death Battle team is very thorough with feats and lore that could be construed as any way vague.
Technically, that puts Saberwolf's reaction capability well within light speed, which John claimed he could match.
But that was just bragging, right?
Hardly. Those Weitzel units John fought were capable of flying across the galaxy, hundreds of millions of light years in only a short time. To be frank, even if John was half Morgan's speed, he'd still be faster than Saberwolf. So, if anything, he wasn't bragging enough.
They've also always been pretty fastidious about matters like practicality, and not taking parameters like speed at face value devoid of context.
Let's look at Swiftwind and Crystal Sundancer. Logically, She-Ra rides these mounts to travel at faster speeds than she is capable of herself.
We know Swifty can zoom around over 450 times the speed of light.
Remember, She-Ra must be slower than Crystal Sundancer, potentially only comparable at a reactionary level if at all. Therefore, at absolute minimum, Wonder Woman was more than 9 billion times faster.
A much bigger difference than the strength comparison, and more than quick enough to stick that magic sword right where it really hurts.
And when assessing some claims made about Omni-Man that support his victory, I respectfully observe that the scruples looked as though they were checked at the door. Nolan at one point is compared to an orbiting satellite disk that blocked a distant planet's exposure to the sun. The coalition of planets used their basic artillery to destroy this sun disk, and Germain characters have said they don't have weapons that can hurt Viltrumites, leading to the show's conclusion that Nolan's durability should exceed this massive satellite. Again, it sounds fair on paper, but it raises questions. When the Coalition says their weapons can't hurt Viltrumites, do they literally mean their gunfire can't pierce their skin? Or do they mean they don't have technology that can track a Viltrumite's speed? Could they mean they don't have resources to replicate enough of the artillery that can hurt a Viltrumite? Do they mean they have weapons that can hurt Viltrumites, but not the technology to use it practically? These all feel like possibilities that could handily poke holes in a statement, which the writers on Death Battle are genuinely pretty good at backing up with more direct evidence. As it stands, the argument that Nolan can withstand the same force as a massive spacecraft he could fit inside feels a bit incurious. To the point that enough people agreed that sun disk scaling became a huge in-joke in the Death Battle fanbase, so much so that the ubiquity of the bit begot a subreddit called r/OKBuddySunDisk for versus community-related gags and shitposting. And I have to respectfully observe that even if you don't think Nolan beating Bardock is accurate, this is an incredibly successful outcome for a show on the verge of death that needs attention. Trite as they say, there's no such thing as bad press. You know an easy way to make Dragon Ball fans fired up and drawn to your video? Making their golden boys lose. And eyes on the train wreck are still eyes, and views, and ad revenue. I think people will read what I'm arguing as a statement made in poor faith. But again, I don't want to accuse the creators of Death Battle of being manipulative or inauthentic. On the contrary, I want to reframe their role in the Versus community that helped me realize why I love the show. They take the role of analysts, but they're also promoters of exciting fights. They're drawing crowds, and it's their jobs to justify a victor and spin the circumstances around their win in a way that gets viewers fired up. The way Vince McMahon knows you want Undertaker to win, but just won't let you have it and will set up a narrative where that's the case. And sometimes that's what breathes life into a show like Death Battle. Think of a fight promo who pays off an athlete to take a fall in round 3 to make a title fight more exciting. That's wildly unethical because it involves real people. No one can get hurt or bribed here in Death Battle because Bardock and Omni-Man aren't real. So maybe, and I truly say maybe, you watched a rigged fight, but fights and games get rigged all the time. And frankly, this is the best case scenario for that, because no one can really be affected by it. It's important to acknowledge when the illusion Death Battle handily casts doesn't work out, so we can better appreciate when it does. Because none of these characters actually exist. The team could say Big the Cat solos Darth Maul, and I guess for all I know, he probably might and could. But my point is, they're not giving you an accurate winner because they're not accurately pitting two real people against each other. Rather, they're working an illusion of a somehow scientific, mathematical, characteristic scenario of these two characters at their strongest coming to blows. And when all of those possibilities explode, the result is often a thing of beauty. When making this battle, I don't think the team was careless or deceptive. I think they were selective with information so Bardock could take a fall in the show's most vulnerable moment when they needed to generate a lot of attention. And when you view these battles with that spin, the culture around it gets downright fascinating. I wanted to poise myself as seeing some clarity in the writing strokes of this episode that many would write off as just a clumsy mistake, and me doing that isn't an attack. I'd even go as far as to give props to the show for not only making a far reach they needed when the show was most at risk, but for continuing to keep up an insane clip of quality after this episode, quelling fears that the series' independent era would consist of pandering for views just to stay afloat. The crew that makes Death Battle are all human. They're not supercomputers that can crunch every fictional aspect of a character together to create a perfect encapsulation of their coming to blows. But it's those imperfections that make the characters feel like champions in a meta-fictional career. And it's fiascos like Bardock versus Omni-Man that you can draw a human reason for, even if you don't agree with it, that makes runbacks like Ash vs. Yugi so satisfying. It helps these characters feel like they have another chance to step into the ring, and it creates a culture where you can root for them and use the climate at play to support or argue against them. If the show was a pure numbers game, I wouldn't have that same emotional attachment, and I think people are reluctant to admit that's no small part of what makes this show kind of beautiful. To put my money where my mouth is, I want to end this video by recommending a handful of my favorite episodes of the show I specifically have not spoiled the outcome of in discussing the series so far. So you can enjoy a baker's dozen or so that I haven't talked your ear off about yet if I've convinced you the show is worth investing your time into. Perhaps most straightforwardly, we have Vegeta versus Thor. Vegeta is just straight up one of my favorite characters ever, and it's nice to see him get a less intuitive but worthy rival here, and the fight is super hype. Shigaraki vs. Mahito has also become one of my go-tos for when I want to rewatch one of my favorite episodes. Two of the best modern anime villains going head-to-head with their unique power sets, which really force the animation team to push what the show is capable of aesthetically in some awe-inspiring ways. If that's not enough arms for you, Goro vs. Machamp is a collision of Pokemon and Mortal Kombat that leaves nothing to not love. I love when underdogs like these get a chance to go at it, and Spawn vs. Ghost Rider is another such instance with insanely cool results. In that same gothic realm, Dio vs. Alucard is as metal as you'd imagine and so well worth watching. Kaiju vs. Kaiju fights can be dodgy because legitimate fight choreo and animation is tough for gigantic characters, but Mechagodzilla vs. the Power Rangers Dragon Sword is everything you'd want in a city-scaling giant robot battle. I don't always think the show works when breaking format, but there's ample proof of the contrary. Scooby-Doo vs. Courage the Cowardly Dog breaks every rule of the series in a way that really works. And among the occasional dips into live-action battles, Blade vs. Buffy wouldn't stand out if lined up with the other well-loved classic episodes of this show. It belongs right with the very best. Balrog vs. TJ combo is also the best case scenario for a fighting game fan. What could have been a super simple comparison of two fighting game movesets was just an insanely hype and narratively conscious bout that I'd say puts a lot of actual boxing sport movies to shame. What that leaves for me to recommend is my favorite episode of the show ever, Bowser vs. Eggman, and it's just absolute cinema. Both juggernauts of the circuits of video game villains pulling out every stop in a battle with actual stakes and arcs. It's fucking amazing. I've watched it so many times since it came out a couple years ago. But above all else, the best way to enjoy Death Battle is just to join in right now. Invest in the next matchup if you know the characters, or if you hear a franchise you love is going to be tied in. It's like a harmless digital fight club where you can see crowds get roused and icons get made and broken and belts passed around. When I say Death Battle has gotten great, this is really what I mean.